Jen.
And this is Chamomile and Clove, our All Souls podcast. Today we are talking about chapters 19, 20, and 21, which takes us solidly into Act 2 and what looks like the midpoint of this story, although I think we can have a conversation about that. So before we get into the meat of what we're planning to do today, we wanted to talk about some chatter that has emerged on Twitter and other social media forums over the past couple weeks about how much of the filming of the TV show is taking place in places like Venice, where Diana doesn't actually go in the first book, and people expressing concerns that the show maybe won't have enough Diana and Matthew. Jen, how do you feel about that?
Well, first I would like to say, we're not going to be spoilery in this conversation. We just wanted to address our opinions on the matter that's been presented. I do not mind that they're expanding the realm of book one at all. And I think, as we're going to discuss, when you have a story that's from a first-person perspective and is so deeply in one person's point of view, it's really difficult to make a TV show that is quote-unquote true to the book and maintains that perspective and doesn't deviate into other parts of the story. It's really difficult, and I think it's easier to be successful if you kind of expand the world around you, at least for this show.
That's certainly true, and there are some limitations to trying to tell a story with a visual medium from one person, one protagonist. And there are some limitations even in the writing of it. So for instance, for us, there is a great deal of exposition that Diana does in the text that would not translate terribly well to a screenplay or to a plot line for an episode, just because she has to do a lot of filling in the blanks for us and we get a lot of interiority from her, which is great. But in film, you'd have to do a voiceover, which Jen and I don't particularly like, or you would be in a position where, like Diana in the book, we are not privy to a lot of information about things that are going on. And sometimes, while we love Diana, being deeply situated in her POV means that we are also in a position where her judgments of things are our judgments of things, and we don't get a lot of perspective on, say, Gillian Chamberlain. We don't get a lot of perspective on Peter Knox or how they got there, what motivated them to be in the Bodleian and be watching Diana in the first place. And that is certainly a weakness of first-person storytelling.
Right. And I think, too, generally in writing, whether it's screenwriting or whether it's in a novel, ideally, the old adage is that you want to show, not tell. And TV is a visual language in which you can show and you don't have to tell. Whereas in the novel, a lot of the times we get Diana telling us things that a TV show can take and show us instead. And it will be more successful in a lot of ways than it is just with Diana telling us something. And they can do a lot more with it.
There's also an opportunity for us to see, we can sort of intimate from the text what we believe to be Diana's worst and best moments and her worst and best traits. But the TV show gives us an opportunity to have a fairer and clearer read on that question. Like, is Diana really being as obtuse in one paragraph as we think she is? Is she really expressing her emotions clearly? We have a lot more space to play with, and I'm really looking forward to, say, the ability to potentially see Diana from Isabeau's perspective, or from the perspective of Sarah and Em in a way that we don't have an opportunity to do when we stay with Diana because of the way that this text is written, because it is written in the first person. It is very difficult to do that.
Right. And I think really, clarify a lot of characters' motivations and intentions by being able to see them on screen, where in the book, a lot of times, even in our discussions on the podcast, we've been questioning people's motivations because it's unclear, because Diana's telling us all of this. So, and the second part of that is we've frequently talked about in the book how the conflict in this book is not as strong as it could be, and how we've discussed previously that bringing in some of the elements like the congregation earlier will really tighten up the conflict in this storyline. So I think that is what they're endeavoring to do, and I'm looking forward to it personally.
I I am too, and I wanted to make a correction to one of our earlier episodes wherein we speculated on the number of episodes. It is 8, and that is not a lot of screen time to get through this book, and you have to cut out some of that interiority to get the full picture and to get this storyline into 8 episodes, which means that I imagine that they will be at Septur by episode 4, maybe, and then you basically have 4 episodes to tie up everything else, including the rest, basically the rest of the book, the second half. And that's a monumental task that you certainly can't do with the somewhat meandering take that Diana does in her first-person narrative.
And I guess ultimately with television adaptations of things, I tend to reserve judgment until I've seen the thing on screen, just because I try to give the creators the benefit of the doubt and trust that like their intentions in making it are good. They want it to be successful. In this case, they all really love the source material and are trying to do the source material justice, and that's, you know, something, however they come about doing that, as long as, you know, their intentions are really good, I think the story's going to come across.
And the good news is you can always retreat into Diana's POV with the original text whenever you want. So whatever the adaptation ends up looking like, and we're certainly excited to see their take on it, this story and this version of the story from Diana's perspective will always be here for us when we want to come back.
Right.
And with that, let's dive into our chapter summary. So in chapter 19, Diana and Matthew go riding, and we discover that Diana uses her magic to communicate with horses. And she sort of runs amok in the saddle, which I can certainly understand and sympathize with. When she comes back, they get involved with the Aurora Consurgence text, and Diana ends up finding Matthew's copy of The Origin of the Species. She takes a nap. They come down for dinner with Isabeau. Begins being rather tense, and then sort of devolves into wine and dancing and storytelling and family time with the de Clermont. And as Diana is dancing with Matthew, she begins floating and shimmering and doing exceptionally witchy things. At the end of this chapter, Matthew ends up taking Diana up to his room so that she can go to sleep, and she rather brazenly invites him to go to bed with her, and he rebuffs her, which we'll talk plenty about in a little bit. Then we get to chapter 21, all is well at Septur, until all of a sudden Domenico Michele shows up, and he is a vampire from Venice who apparently knows Matthew from the way back and has a bit of a beef with the de Clermont family. There is a confrontation in which Domenico threatens both Matthew and Diana and says that they must separate before they break the covenant. Isabeau ends up taking Diana inside. She unfurls the Ouroboros from the top of the tower at Septur, and then Matthew goes streaking away on a horse, presumably in pursuit of Domenico, and then we end the chapter.
So a little bit of a, I guess, not really a cliffhanger ending in our podcast, but a little bit of, we end it on kind of unsure footing in chapter 21, which is fun.
And yet, I think that it's an appropriate break because so much has changed. We have moved from a place where Diana and Matthew are essentially safe to a place where they're absolutely not. And our understanding of the world that they're operating in has changed to the point where they can't go on as they have without actively making a decision about it. So,
should we go riding?
Yes, we can go riding and then maybe talk structure a little bit later.
Okay.
So, for those of you who don't know, we do have another podcast called Queens of All Trades, where once upon a time I talked about the fact that I ride horses a lot. And this chapter takes more more investment of belief for me than almost any other chapter in the book. And it takes me believing that Diana's doing magic the whole flipping time, because while I get the beautiful, wonderful fantasy of like, this is my new boyfriend, he gave me a pony, there is no one, I do mean no one, who gets back on a horse after 20 years and rides like they've never gotten off. No, you are all feet and hands and legs, and the horse probably doesn't want you up there. You're a sack of potatoes. This is BS.
Right.
It could also be that I'm just jealous that Diana was able to do this when I cannot.
I mean, who is not? And I I buy that she's using magic and doesn't know it, because we hit briefly on in the last chapter when she goes to visit the horses and how she may be communing with them, because these are all unfamiliar horses to her, and normally you would not do this with horses that you do not know. And so that she may be having a bit of a communion with the animals that she doesn't even know is happening in order to allow all of this to come about. So while I would say to Kate, I understand in the real life.
Yes. And I know truth is no defense for fiction, but this is, I am admitting to you in my little
that you
podcast,
have to suspend your disbelief a lot.
In my podcast confessional, I have to say that this is the factual place where I'm like, hold up. As someone who had a humiliating writing lesson last night, where a Frenchman told me that I perhaps needed to find a new hobby. Not really. It's not what he said. No, the horse, Mirabelle, mostly said that. She was like, this is ridiculous. But anyways, so I have some difficulty with this chapter, and I think it's mostly my own bitterness over the fact that I can't leap onto an unfamiliar horse and be like, I ride like I never got off.
Yeah, and also that you have not been just gifted with fancy new riding apparel from your rich boyfriend.
Other places where I have to really invest some belief.
Which, how would that fit? It would not fit her. It would not fit her.
It might not fit her, but also there is no one who is comfortable riding in new boots the first time. I literally, like, my boots are relatively old.
She would not be able to walk.
Correct. I bought them like 18 months ago and I've been breaking them in. They still cut me on the interior of my calf, right at the knee, because the leather is still so stiff. Absolutely not.
Oh, but Matthew checked hers to make sure it wouldn't rub on her legs, so it was fine.
I tried, y'all. Like, this is actually, and it's not, like, normally I tend to have intelligent reasons, I feel, for skimming over parts of a book. And I know it's supposed to be super romantic, and I know that it's all about, like, Diana getting in touch with her wild goddess spirit and the horse. I got it.
The huntress is free.
This is a chapter where I literally go... because it's laying it on a bit thick for me as someone who spends a lot of time around horses. And I got it. Don't at me. I got it.
I shall give you an apple later. It'll be fine. To appease you.
Thank you.
Oh, did you have anything else you wanted to say about RE writing?
No, I think I've said quite enough.
I like it as somebody who has not ridden in probably 20 years, and I never rode English. I have always ridden Western style, so that is quite a different experience in both the clothing and the writing style for me. I enjoy the romance of it. I do find the ease with which she participates to be a bit unbelievable.
I do hope that when they film it for the TV series, as I believe they
that she's just
done,
like flopping around on the horse, like.
No, I actually hope that they film it the way they do all of those like galloping on hilltop scenes in Poldark. You know, where there's like the classical music and then they're riding through the sunlight and there's much
sweepingly
galloping.
Romantic. There's much galloping.
Much galloping, which is wonderful and romantic, but also exhausting.
You get to the top, you're like, we can't make out yet because I can't breathe.
I would like to point out that if this were really happening, the horse isn't the only person who would be winded, because you basically have to hold yourself up with your tummy the whole time that the horse is running and not
makes it hard to breathe.
It does. Or it just makes it like it's more of a cardiovascular investment than most people anticipate. I wanted to talk very briefly about Matthew giving his perspective on Isabeau on page 244, where he talks about how Isabeau feels about witches.
Oh, is this about her being jealous?
Yes.
Where he says she's jealous of witches?
Yes.
I don't know if I buy that.
Really?
I think he's not giving her the real reason why Isabeau doesn't like her.
I think there's that.
I mean, I guess it's not the primary reason why our Isabeau doesn't like Diana. The primary reason why is because of his sister and everything that happened with Louisa. That is why Isabel does not like witches. The secondary reason may be that she's jealous because she at one time had some, not necessarily powers, but some abilities that she no longer has. But I think saying, "Oh, honey, my mom just doesn't like you because she's jealous of you," in this case is incorrect.
I also think it would be a really weird thing to say to your significant other.
Yeah.
The more I process that, I'm like, ooh, Matthew.
And there's also, like, not a lot of... yeah, he's like, oh, she's jealous of you. But then there's, like, not a lot of follow-up. So you're like, so what is she jealous of exactly? Other than, like...
So if that's the case, why do we think that Matthew is offering that explanation?
Because Matthew keeps a lot of secrets and doesn't like to tell people things to the detriment, in the future of everybody.
Well, in that case, do we think that this is really a lie, or is it just not the whole truth? Do we think that this is something...
I think it's just not the whole truth. Like, he's picked the easier of the two reasons to talk to Diana about, and I don't really know his reasoning behind that.
There is something to it, though, because in the text, when Isabeau talks about Diana being repulsively green, and the way that she is able to, even later in this chapter and the next chapter, that she has so much potential that she's not using. I can accept, based on that textual read, that there is some bitterness and some jealousy that is mixed into there, because Diana has power in a way that Isabeau, while she has long life and while she has strength and speed and intelligence, etc., simply doesn't have and will never have.
Right. And she's also alone, whereas Diana is now not alone. So do we think then it's like maybe he's giving her the more immediate reason for... I don't know. I just don't think it's not the only reason, and I'm not sure why he picks that over the other one.
Nor am I.
At this time.
I don't find it to be an especially satisfying answer, but it would appear that Diana accepts it to the extent that he gives it to her. And she goes into this question about dying easily, which I think is a little bit odd.
What does she say about dying easily?
Why does she envy that witches die so easily? And then we have that moment where he says, because she misses my father. And maybe I find it odd only because I understand that Matthew doesn't like to tell the things that he knows and that he doesn't like to tell other people's stories for them. But now would be a really great time to describe the vampire mating bond and what it does and what it means.
Mm-hmm. You've just had this romantic ride out into the countryside. You're going to have some serious conversations. Why not also have that serious conversation?
Because that's sort of...
before more things happen.
That's sort of the underlying thing here, is that Isabeau's grief is one of the reasons that she's so motivated to protect Matthew, particularly in the sense that she's trying to protect Matthew from someone she perceives to be a fundamental threat to his life and to his happiness.
Yeah. So why not have that whole conversation? Is that Matthew just, like, being patriarchal again? Like, he's giving the easy answer instead of the pertinent answer? Or just not explaining himself fully where he should?
I don't know, because I don't know that I necessarily read it as being patriarchal. I think I read it as being the old adage, like, it's not my tale to tell. I'm going to tell you what I can without revealing too much of what is really going on with somebody. It's not for me to say.
Right. Which I feel like is used inconsistently in the books. But we'll get to that more later. The whole, like, not telling other people's tales thing is a very loosey-goosey rule, it seems like.
It's more of a guideline.
It's more of a guideline. There is one thing I wanted to ask that we skipped over a little bit, which is we talked about the dream last time where she's riding the horse and she's the huntress and she tells the horse to fly and then the horse flies. And then in here, they have that moment where they're racing and she just, like, ducks down and tells the horse to fly, and they're, like, having this moment where she's obviously riding by magic and Matthew has to catch up and be like, what the flip are you doing?
Also, please stop. You terrified me.
Yes, please stop. It's a legitimate response. But do we think then that her dream was a premonition, or what do we think about that? Because she just dreamed about this thing happening and then it kind of, like, literally just did happen the next day. So Is it a new power that she's displaying? Is it a premonition that she's displaying? Or is she just doing it because she dreamed about it? What do you think about it?
I sort of read it as she's willing it into being. You know, she has this moment where she connects with the dream, and she connects with a more elemental version of herself, a version of herself that is immersed in and accepting of her power, and she lets it out. And I don't know. I mean, it could be some sort of premonition or precognition. That isn't a read that I had thought of before, but maybe it's a bit circular. Maybe she dreams it because she's going to do it, but she does it because she dreams it.
And the only reason I'm asking is because we've been kind of like tallying, you know, her new powers as they kind of emerge. So I'm wondering if we're considering it a new thing. Certainly the communicating with the animals is new. And we get that now in this chapter, although we suspected it last time.
Do you think that this is the first time that she uses her witch's sight?
I think for us in the book it is. I don't know in her life, but I think recently it is. Although rowing, you could make the argument that when she rows, she uses it. We kind of talked about that a little bit, but there's not like real evidence except that she rows with her eyes closed and she seems to, or she walks with her eyes closed and she seems to know exactly what's going on. So I think this is the first evidence that it is like well and truly magic, not just like her having good instincts for things. Yeah. Anyway, just wanted to know your thoughts on that. There's a funny, I guess, simile that Diana uses in this chapter that I thought was odd, and I wanted to know your thoughts on it. She said, it's the thing about witches being dunked in water. And I don't remember, but she uses it as a simile, and she's like, oh, they like that about as much as witches being dunked in water. And I was like, that seems like an odd... It doesn't really work for me. Like, I kind of get where it's going to, like, witch trials, I guess. But, like, it was so weird and it just, like, jumped out and I was like, whoa. That's not how metaphors work.
I mean, it doesn't especially work for me. I know what she's trying to communicate there, which is that many horses are reluctant to give you their feet, but there are also a bunch that just don't care, or they're well-mannered enough not to care. So
that's what it was. It was showing their feet for inspection, yes, and that they don't like it about as much as witches apparently dislike being dunked in water. Which is that a Wizard of Oz poll or is it a witch trial poll? Like, what are we doing with that? I'm not sure.
Also, when people make similes like that, they usually speak from personal experience, and I just don't think that there's any textual support for the idea that Diana has been dunked in water at a witch trial, because this is an Outlander.
True.
We are mercifully free of witch trials.
Yeah, it just, like, it kind of kicks me out every time I read past it, because, like, it's so odd, and I just wanted to see if I was the only one who finds it so odd.
No, that is a clunky little pebble that gets stuck in my shoe every time, too.
Your proverbial shoe.
My proverbial shoe.
Your hoof.
My reading shoe.
Your reading shoe. Anyway, we can move on.
It puts a little hitch in my get along.
Exactly. A hitch in your giddy up, partner.
Correct. Appropriate for a riding episode. And then we get to the clearing.
DNA.
Where apparently we're having like a romantic conversation overlooking, I just imagine like overlooking the countryside of the Auvergne on like a beautiful fall day. The leaves are changing. The horses are making that happy, contented, grass crunching noise.
Crunchy sound, yes.
And then Matthew's like, shall we talk about your DNA?
I mean, mood
Way to
killer.
kill the mood.
But I guess yes. Like, when else would you do it, Matthew? Now is as good a time as any. Maybe okay, I get that he probably wanted to do it out of vampire earshot.
Yes, I was about to say, it makes sense to do it
but
away from the house.
the mood is not... It's not the right place, mood-wise.
Well, it depends on the mood you're trying to create.
Yeah, but we're going to do it anyway, so...
So anyways, we find out that Diana has a laundry list of abilities.
As we previously discussed a little bit, she has all the things. She is the witchiest witch.
And she has, like, all of these particular powers that seem like they're really important, and then the one where it's like, this helps witches find lost things. And I'm like, I would like that, please.
You're like, that is a very specific gene to pull out.
It has its own marker?
Clearly, I don't have that gene.
And then it's like a tiny plot hole, because it's like, then why can't she get to the Bodleian and get the book?
Why can't she find the thing?
I don't know. Like, sometimes Diana's really lost in this series, and I'm like, well, that gene is not being helpful.
It's definitely recessive.
So she has all the elemental markers, so she can play with all of the elements: air, fire, earth, and water. You know, she can do spell casting and charms and curses. She would have excelled at Hogwarts, is what they're telling me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, charms class would have been excellent for her.
She could have done defense against the dark arts, no question.
Yeah. Without a wand, too. So, because we are wandless here in the All Souls trilogy. We do have here, I think, possibly for one of the first times, or at least this time, we're explicitly separating witchcraft from magic. How do you feel about that?
I don't know that I've devoted a lot of thought to it, other than the idea that perhaps there is a desire, even amongst sort of intra-species, to dictate a hierarchy and to say that these things are different and they come from different places and therefore we should keep them separate or treat them separately.
Right. And really the only reason I bring it up is because going forward we semi-inconsistently treat it like it's important. Sometimes we're like very clear in differentiating, no, this is this and that is you know, magic versus this is definitely witchcraft. And it doesn't really serve a purpose. And having them all be genetic, I feel like kind of defeats the whole argument for having one versus the other. Like, this is witchcraft and this is magic, but they're all genetic. So it doesn't work for me, really.
I think it works for me better as I am finishing the Book of Life for like the 6th time. And without saying any more about that, I think that one of the themes that we can continue to track is the idea of lost things, lost knowledge, lost understanding. And that as people and cultures begin to differentiate, as they begin to categorize, and as they begin to try and order their world over time by virtue of change and war and death and any number of other things, you end up with a sometimes complicated or convoluted understanding of things that maybe you didn't have centuries before.
Right. So we're saying the characters in this book at this time, and not just Diane and Matthew, but Sarah and Em as well, have an imperfect understanding of their history and their powers, I guess. And, you know, what is supposed to function as magic versus what is witchcraft, and are those even two different things? We don't know, but they don't actually know either.
I think that that's where I come down on it. I do think that it's remarkable in this series that there isn't really a formalized school of witchcraft, or it's all sort of organic. It's handed down, it seems matriarchally, from one witch to another down the line, and that you learn the spells that your grandparent cast and that your grandparents' grandparents cast, and that magic is passed down in that sort of ad hoc, organic, word of mouth type way, which leads me to believe, just by virtue of that means of preservation and education, that there would be things that are imperfect, that are lost, that are misunderstood, or perhaps what happens if you are a witch who possesses a number of these powers, but the person who taught you, i.e. your grandmother or your grandfather or your mom or your dad or your aunt,
doesn't have them and can't teach you.
Correct. And like what kinds of holes would that leave in the education of a witch? And how important is it that there are those kinds of gaps?
And even if like nobody in your coven has any of these genes that are like manifesting, like what do you do then? Do you just like not use that power? Or are you dangerous then because nobody could teach you how to use it?
Yeah, and then it also raises the question for me of, if it is an oral tradition, or even as we talk about later, even if it's somewhat a written tradition, or everything about it when it's handed down like that is a version of storytelling. And the question of who tells the story, who is in the story, who is excluded from the story, and who benefits from the story, I think is just as important within families and within traditions when we talk about how magic is taught, magic is understood, or magic is passed down.
And the good thing about this is something that we're definitely, the series is going to unpick as we go along. So even in this book, we're going to continue broadening our understanding of not just like witches and witchcraft, but the entire creature world. And this is something that we will be learning along with our characters. It's just, this is the point at which we're like trying to present what magic is, but at this point it's not, we as readers don't necessarily understand it, and it's unclear because the characters are also kind of lost in this respect.
And I wonder, while we were talking about adaptation and about a broader version of the All Souls, how differently a Peter Knox character or a Gillian Chamberlain character would talk about what magic is, how it's used, and what is possible in the realm of magic. And the premise for that, I think, is laid in that first moment in Matthew's laboratory where Miriam starts talking about the declining powers of witches, and that modern witches are less powerful. They have fewer children. They have fewer of the elemental magics. And it would be interesting to hear the tale of how that happened and why that is from the mouths of the antagonist, from the Peter Knox.
Shall we go back inside and look at Matthew's book collection?
Why not? It's a very pretty book collection.
It is an extensive book collection.
It's an extensive and very important book collection.
It is like the library of libraries, basically.
If you're going to have a boyfriend that gives you new boots and horses and has a chateau in France, then why not have him have the library of libraries?
And all the wine. And, you know, your potential future mother-in-law, not ideal, but the other things might balance it out. God, we spend a lot of time with Matthew's book collection in chapter 20 before we even get to origins.
What do you think that is doing in the text?
Okay, I was thinking about this because even the device that we have of Aurora and Matthew using that to kind of like convince Diana to come to France with him. He's like, I have this copy of this book that nobody's ever seen before. Sure, fine, great. You can use it for your keynote address, blah, 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 blah. But in the broader plot of this book, this is completely unimportant. It does nothing. The origins, you know, talking about origin of the species, that does. But all the stuff we get with Aurora and like exploring Matthew's library and like going through and her making notes on all of the paintings and stuff, it literally means nothing to the plot.
Do we think that it is related to the time that they have dinner at his house and they begin talking about his history, and it's another layering device for making it real for Diana, how long he's lived and how many past lives he has behind him?
Yeah, I mean, in looking at his book, sure, but doing the whole research with the text that he is giving her, I find to be tedious because it's meaningless. And I like
the Aurora Consurgence portion.
Yes. Because she starts off there, and then, you know, she gets distracted because she's looking for the reference book, and then she goes through, you know, seemingly his entire personal library from beginning to end. And it does add another layer of history, but I think we've gotten quite a lot of that already. So I think it just takes a bit too long, and it weighs down this section of the book a bit, I think, because we keep doing this and it means nothing to the plot.
Right. I think that we are still on sort of like the extended romantic weekend date in the country.
Yes,
and
but we're doing quite a lot of it.
Right, but I think that that's less frustrating the first time through because you're caught up with Diana in Diana's POV, because clearly Diana is enjoying this. Diana's having a lovely time.
And I think that's just like my personal, you know, having read it through several times and now reading it through like fairly deeply to make notes on it, I'm like, okay. But if you're only looking at the romance, it does do a lot to push the romantic side of the book.
I do not find it to be too much for me, if only because I have been bound up in this reading with looking at the allegory, essentially, that's contained within it, and wondering what Deb is trying to say, or what the text is trying to say about the nature of Matthew and Diana's relationship vis-a-vis that allegory. And so that really comes later for me as we go more deeply into the Aurora Consurgence and into the, I believe it's in chapter 21, where we start to do that a little bit more. But the bit on Origins was the first time, I think, in my first read where I thought that the scene in Marcus's laboratory was actually really truly a part of a larger plot. And I think that it has sort of a subtle tie to the central narrative conflict that's a bit difficult to tease out on a first read.
Right. And I like her reading through Origins and reading all of his notes just from the relationship aspect of the book. I like that because I think that gives us more depth into Matthew's character than just like getting a description of all of his possessions. So I think it's a bit more effective just in terms of their relationship and kind of like figuring out his motivations for like doing all of the things that he's doing, basically, and what he wants, and answering questions.
And answering the research questions, but I was going to agree with you and say that what it does for Matthew's interiority is actually quite strong in terms of giving him giving us his thoughts in his own words contemporaneously with the thing that he is reading. And one of the things that I had not really contemplated prior to reading this part of the text again is how successfully Deborah Harkness manages to convey the annotations as though they really are Matthew's voice from 1859. Right.
Yeah, I think the voice work in there is really, really good. You know, having the tone and voice of a younger Matthew.
And of a Matthew who is enraptured and fascinated by an idea. A Matthew of ideas, a Matthew of solutions and problem solving and of intellectual pursuit. A Matthew who corresponded and talked big ideas with the Darwins of the world, which is a lovely romantic conceit anyway, even if it does fall slightly into that historical tourism trap of no one can possibly have existed in the 19th century without knowing all the famous people.
Which is yeah. It's a big pet peeve of mine that we're going to talk about at length in book 2, but we do get a little bit of it here.
Although in book 2, she at least has a hook for it. She has a historical hook. But we can talk about it later. No spoilers here. None.
No spoilers here. No. And I think, too, it displays a lot more of a philosophical side because his arguments that he's written in Origins are much more philosophical than the Matthew we have now, who is much more separated into strictly science and not as much philosophy. He is just hard science now. So I think it's very interesting to notice that shift in his ideals.
It's also a very nice and deft callback to the conversation that they have in the diner, where he is saying all the good scientists have questions, not answers. And, or whatever the quote is, where he starts talking about this is the only question worth asking, which is an interesting philosophical singularity, I think, to come back and say the only question worth asking is why are we here? How are we here? And it's lovely and elegant, and I think puts a very nice touch on Matthew's intellect, which I like.
And we do get a bit of discussion about creature instincts. Hey, this would be another great time to talk about vampire mating, wouldn't it?
Although, to be fair to Matthew, she is reading his book, and he doesn't necessarily know exactly what she's reading. That's true,
I guess. I think he knows. I think he's keeping tabs on her as she moves about the room, and he's just acting like he doesn't. He's just letting her run free reign of the library. So many horse metaphors. Yes.
And then we have Diana getting ready for dinner with Isabeau, and we have a discussion of how much Diana likes bell-necked or bell-armed sleeves and funnel necks, which...
Okay, a funnel neck? That's called a turtleneck. She's all, it had a funnel-shaped neck, and I was like, this is called a turtleneck.
It could also be a cowl neck, to be honest.
It could be a cowl, but I feel like...
That's a big funnel.
Right, but then you either call it a cowl neck or a turtleneck. But saying a long sleeve shirt with a funnel-shaped neck, I'm like, that's just a turtleneck. It seemed unnecessary.
Of all the things to snag on.
I get snagged on Diana's clothing quite a lot.
Well, she snags it on a lot of boats, so maybe that's fair.
She does. Maybe the sweater has been snagged on boats before as well. Yes, but she gets très fancy.
She gets très fancy, and she goes downstairs to see Isabeau, who gives her a long sniff and then a very black look because she smells like Matthew, which I feel like Isabeau should already know. Go on.
I have another comment before we get too far into our delightful dinner and with Isabeau, which is Matthew all of a sudden starts saying "do."
Yes, he does.
In this chapter. He has not previously said that.
True.
It's a big pet peeve of mine, especially it happens a lot in romances where the characters are from two separate countries and the man will say a word from his native language in the book to the female character, but he doesn't start saying it until now, and he says "do," and I'm like, okay, but like, why does that have to be in French? Why is that the only thing you say in French? Why do you start saying it now? Why is this necessary?
Have you noticed that it's mostly exclamations and or terms of endearment?
Yes.
That is 90% of and that is, I think, it's worth having a tiny digression into the slight controversy of the use of foreign language in English-speaking books and or like whether you should translate, not translate, italicize, not italicize. It is honestly a debate that I don't have the time or the energy to get into, other than to say that sometimes it can be very successful, sometimes not. Matthew is increasingly French when we're in France, and then he sort of backs off of it, so the inconsistency is a little bit annoying.
And I would buy it more if he had used it earlier with other people. Like, for example, if he had said it while he was at Hamish's house, like I can think of a few conversations where it would have been appropriate to be inserted into those at Hamish's house, but he seems to only use it when Diana's around, so it feels very artificial. And
it feels very like Frenchy boyfriend speaking French, you know?
Do. But only the one word.
I do actually, just as a note, when they're about to go into Sator for the first time, when he says courage, I actually really like that, but that might just be me.
The do I can't get behind, and it reminds me a little bit of Outlander, because I think Jamie has a few of things like that in Outlander.
Oh, for sure. I do actually buy, in this chapter, though, Isabeau trying to keep switching languages to keep ahead of Diana, though. Like, I think that that's actually a nice character note for her, that she's just going to sort of outmaneuver this intruder in her house.
That works really well, and it's character-based, but the, foreign boyfriend saying one random word in French does not work for me. And I just had to say that. And if it bothers anyone else, yay. And if it doesn't bother anyone else, I'm sorry.
Then you can glide happily past and pay no attention to us. Everything we say can be taken or left as you see fit.
Yes. Okay. Anyway, sorry. Ooh, and we get some suspicious tea as well. Mart to make some suspicious tea before we go down for dinner.
But before we do that, we also have Isabeau and Mart and Matthew being at home together in a way that is really relaxed and wonderful. And we get Matthew's humor and Isabeau's capacity for humor. So while she is still
very angsty about the situation,
while she's still a bit frigid in this chapter, we begin to understand that there is a warmer creature under there. There is a creature that, if she is being cruel to Diana, it is out of love and protectiveness of Matthew, because she's a fundamentally good creature who really does love her son. It's not based in necessarily animosity. Well, it is. Maybe that's not the right thing to say. It's based in a hatred for the threat that Diana is, not a personalized hatred. And I thought it was lovely that they're being a family, but also that Diana has this moment where she's still sort of a creature apart.
But I like that she is able to see that they're all very much a family, as opposed to everybody being very prim and proper because she's a guest, which they very much are not.
But there's also that note of family is family is family, and that no matter how different families are, be they witch, vampire, or demon, or human.
Or mixed, or whatever.
Or mixed, being in a family feels the same anywhere, and that it is a source of comfort. It doesn't have to be a source of claustrophobia and fear, which I think is maybe the first time that we have Diana express or sort of confront how alone she has felt in a certain way.
I mean, because she has Sarah and Em, but she hasn't been at home with them for quite some time. She hasn't had a family atmosphere around her, and even being at home with Sarah and Em is still very complicated because of the death of her parents.
And because of Diana's relationship with magic. I think one of the things that is not holding her back from her ability to participate with Matthew and Martin Isabeau is the fact that she doesn't have this fundamental sort of value distinction between them about what she should and should not do with her power, which is an interesting thing to bring in later this chapter after we do the dancing and the floating and the spinning about.
Which is very fun.
It is super fun. And this chapter overall is quite romantic. You know, it is settling us firmly in the... We are not in a will they or won't they type story. We are in a when they type story, which is refreshing because the conflict that we get between Matthew and Diana in the next couple of chapters, I think, is quite real indeed and very much worth discussing. But then we have this moment after the floating and the dancing and the fact that Isabeau can't stay in one dance at a time, that she does a bit of the Volta and a bit of the Tarantella and a bunch of other things.
And she knows them all. She knows all the dances.
Of course she does. And then Isabeau is the first one who really, I think in a real way, is able to check Matthew in his paternalism about Diana's power.
And she is really the one who kind of like brings it up to the forefront and is like, so about this thing that she can do.
But it's also an interesting moment of softening because it's the first time that Isabeau also realizes that Diana really doesn't do this consciously, that this is not, you know, a witch who has come to sort of lord her power over her, that she's not ensnared Matthew. It's unconscious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's what my man Diana doesn't use her powers on purpose or whatever, and Isabel's like, okay, so we have an untrained witch in the house. Please explain this to me.
This would seem to be an important thing to tell me about my house guest.
Yes, and also why.
What do you think of Isabeau's discussion of this as childish behavior? What do you think of that framing?
What does she say specifically? She says
enough of this childishness. It's time for you to grow up, Diana, and accept responsibility for who you are.
Well, and I think, and as we talked about before, Diana has, up to this point, she's been in a lot of denial, which you could argue is very childish. She's in denial about, her situation and her powers, and she has chosen not to learn anything about magic growing up, which you could also argue is not a very responsible decision. I don't want to say adult, but it's not a very responsible decision that she's made. So I could see the argument for Isabeau being like, you're being a child. You need to be more responsible.
So I think that sort of touches on a nerve, right? And that is the idea that when we are young and when we are children, we can convince ourselves that there are boundaries, that there are lines, that there are rules that we can follow that will keep the world and us safe in ways that are predictable and that are well defined. And I think that part of adulthood and part of growing up, and as a side note, one of my theories about the Harry Potter series, is about learning what it means when that's just not the case. That part of becoming an adult is realizing that to the extent that you can keep yourself safe and to the extent that you can learn to use power, there's no set of rules other than those that you create for yourself and those that you learn by trial and error that will ever make you a moral, upstanding, decent person worthy of holding power.
Right. And as we've discussed previously, Diana has definitely set those boundaries for herself that, as we have presented to us textually, were made at a point in her life when she was very young, but also when she was afraid and had suffered a tragic loss, and that they were not made in necessarily a clear-headed space. Not that children can't be responsible, because I think calling it childish is not necessarily the appropriate. I buy it coming from the character, but it's just not necessarily the appropriate word to use, because
immature would probably be better.
Yeah. But I see where she's going with that.
And that it is the result of trauma, that Diana is a deeply traumatized person, and that is a place from which I can understand some of Matthew's reticence to be honest with her, or to impose boundaries and relationships on her that she's not ready for, in the sense that she hasn't fully discovered who she is yet, much less who she might be when she's with him. And to that extent, I understand some of his conservative response to her later in this chapter, which we'll get to in just a minute. But I also do find that it would be a lot more palatable to me if he talked about that.
Yes.
So there is a great deal of very hot and heavy romance for a minute. There is some face stroking.
Time.
There is some kissy time. There is some, like, are we doing this or not sort of thing. And then Diana's like, I have had enough of the waiting, and I should like to take our relationship next level.
Let's go upstairs. Take me to bed or leave me forever. Take me to bed or leave me.
Thanks, Goose.
It was his wife. Thank you.
True.
It was Lady Goose. I can't remember her name.
Lady Goose.
Sorry, it was a little bit of a deep cut Top Gun reference. I apologize.
Listeners, what you don't know is that Jen and I make deep cut Top Gun references to one another a lot.
All the time. Anyway, and so she wants to take it to the next level, and Matthew's like, no, but he doesn't provide her with an explanation. How do we feel about this, Kate? Should we say upfront, anyone can say no? Consent is important. Consent on both sides. He said no. She does respect his boundaries. However, we also both agree that communication is important in a mature relationship. So what is it that we need in this situation?
Now would be a great time to explain what sex does to the vampire mating bond, or just generally like what vampire mating is at all. I buy that part of this comes from Matthew being in denial, which I think that we have a certain amount of textual support for the idea that he is trying to ignore what is going on biologically and emotionally for him. But I think that that's rather ridiculous of him by the time he takes her to France. I think that by the time she gets the picture in the mail and he puts her on the plane to France, he is fully aware of what is happening, and he is complicit and along for the ride and has decided he doesn't care anymore. And while he can say no for any reason at any time, both of them can. That's wonderful. We want everything to be like happy and voluntary and consensual both ways.
We would also like both of our characters to have all the information to make an informed consensual decision.
Especially to the extent that he can see that this hurts her. And it hurts her, it rebuffs her, it puts her in a position where she's unsure about something she should not be unsure of. And he, at this point, in my opinion, owes her a full explanation, or a fuller explanation, other than, I would prefer to wait because we have time.
Not an explanation.
He owes her an explanation that is a long time coming for why this is such a huge step for him particularly, and as a species, and also for the two of them.
The two of them in that, like, not just the vampire mating thing, but the congregation and the covenant, and how them having the sexy times might start a creature war.
Right.
For example, a small detail that could be provided.
Right. I mean, the fact that you are about to have the naughty time with someone that might mean, like, the destruction of everything you love is really essential for informed consent. or also informed non-consent. Like, I believe that this is just a discussion that ought to be had. I do understand that it would take away from the romance for him to be like, let's sit down.
Sure, mood killer. But it's also...
He already killed the mood. It's gone.
I know. It's also a mood killer to have the person that you're very interested in and you think is interested in you. You know, you have this like heavy petting and sexy kissing. And for one of you to be like, hey, let's go upstairs. And the other person's like, nah. And you're like,
You know
that
what would also be
an uncomfortable situation.
You know what would also be a really sexy conversation to have here? And it's not necessarily the one about the covenant, because I could even buy putting that one off. If he does what he may or may not do later in this book, where he maybe has a conversation with her about, you are just coming into your own now. You are just coming out of your restrictions that you have placed upon yourself. You are discovering who you are in a new way. And before we take this step and before we make this kind of a commitment...
It's important for your identity.
It is important for your identity and for your sense of self that you are secure in that before we start doing this thing. Or maybe even put it in a personal thing and say, if we do this, I will have a great deal of difficulty allowing you the space to do the things that you need to do, because for me and for my people, this is a huge deal. It's even bigger than it is for humans, and particularly when it's for a particular human. So even if we didn't get into like the congregation creature war, which would just be like, I'm never taking my pants off again, we could still have a really lovely, emotionally grounded conversation about, I would love to. However, my interest has not diminished. Please come back to me.
I think you're very sexy.
Let us continue.
I want all the sex with you.
Right. Let us continue to have this conversation as your understanding of yourself, like of your identity, continues to develop. I'll still sing you to sleep, which is kind of awesome.
And snuggle you.
Snuggle.
And kiss you. And this is all, any of these things would have been perfectly reasonable and important to talk about at this time.
But we don't, and that's fine.
We don't do it.
I find it more frustrating every time I read it. Again, I'm not sure if it was my first time through that I would necessarily be thrown by that, but knowing what I
was.
Really?
Yes. Having my first time through been just a few months ago, and now I'm on 3 times through. But my first time through, we got to that part and he was like, no. And then they moved on. And I was like, wait, he's not going to say anything about anything? Like, as a woman, like, on the very basic level, that's an uncomfortable situation. And he does nothing to, like, make her feel more comfortable.
Let's have
a
little, like, romance novel confessional in here for a minute. There's also a point in romance novels where you're like, ooh, are we doing this? Are we doing this? Should I not be reading this on the train? Right? And...
Should I wait?
Should I wait? Because I feel like this is not for public consumption. Because it always feels a little voyeuristic. You know, like, romance novels have a certain...
It gets a little hot
ebb and flow of intimacy. And I would say that the page before that, you're like, oh, and then...
Ooh, we're flowing.
We're flowing.
And then we stop.
And then we come to an abrupt halt, which is fine. Again, I'm glad that it is based on the, this is not a good idea for me right now, like, both parties should be consenting. I'm glad that we don't get into any weird, like, he is overcome by the scent of her and just has to have her now type thing. I'm looking at you, Cressley Cole. Like, we don't get into any of that weird rapey nonsense. I'm really glad that we stay in these boundaries. I still think that a better version of Matthew, a version of Matthew that is not so invested in his secrets and keeping shit close to the vest, is a Matthew that says, we should talk.
And also a Matthew that we have seen to be really connected to Diana's emotional state, I feel like, in like 2 chapters ago, would have at least reassured her of the situation. That Matthew exists in this book.
Although he does, with a certain amount of tenderness, bring the hand to his heart so that she can feel that he wants to. I think that's what that's supposed to be doing. Whether it's really successful, I think, is another question.
And I'm like...
Jen's not buying it.
I don't buy it.
Not buying it.
Nope.
I think she's just disappointed that she didn't get to do the naughty in a room set ablaze with candles.
I'm disappointed as well.
Frustration abounds.
I'm disappointed for her. I'm like, you have that huge luxurious bathroom, you have all the candles and the fireplace and the big bed, and you're in a castle. I'm also disappointed for Diana.
So much naughty potential, so little payoff.
I'm with her. I'm with your girlfriend. I'm ready to put my yoga pants back on and have some cookies.
So instead, she lies down in bed and she's like, sing me one of Mart's naughty songs, please. Which is fine, and I think it's really sweet that he chooses one that presumably his father wrote for Isabeau.
It's Philippe's, love song. Are we doing Felipe? Or because I say Philippe because I think Felipe is a ridiculous name.
In the audiobook, it's Philippe, so I'm keeping that.
Fabulous.
Felipe would only work if he were from Spain.
Thank you. And I thought with the double P, I was like, in the E at the end. Is it Philippe or Felipe? Thank you. It's Philippe from now on. Headcanon accepted.
So we're in chapter 21, and this is where we have all that really pretty allegory stuff about do not refuse me because I am dark and shadowed. The fire of the sun has altered me. The reason I think that I love these passages is that when Matthew and Diana are at their best and when they are their best partnership, it's because they accept, celebrate, and embrace the dark and the light of each other, their best and worst qualities, and their capacity, their understanding of their capacity to reinforce both the best and the worst of each other, and how they are always striving to encourage one another to be better when the time comes, but not shying away from the darkness.
And I think I enjoy the allegory as well, and I think you are correct. I think it doesn't work for me because it is a bit heavy-handed for me. Like, we keep getting it, over and over and over again, and it's not... There are so many other things that are done so lightly in this book that this, for me, is just a bit too heavy. Like, it's layered on too thick in these chapters. For me.
Although, to be fair, we only really get it for 2 pages before we take a restorative walk and run into a nasty vampire.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's still too much for me, but I understand if, it might not be too much for other people. I have a short attention span, so...
I think structurally we should talk about Domenico Micheli and what he does. So... For me, I think that the reversal in this book is beginning by the time that Domenico gets to Septor. And when you look at story structure, there are things called anchor scenes, essentially, and there are a number of them. There are podcasts that discuss them much better than we do. But one of the ideas that you get in the second act, the act where things get worse, is that there is a moment where the tide turns against your protagonist and everything that seemed to be going so well suddenly goes into crisis mode, into a pinch point.
It's up in a puff of smoke. Poof.
And what Domenico does for me really, really well is that he synthesizes a choke point and a crisis point for both the romance and for the central narrative conflict, even though his relationship to the Peter Knox in the book and the congregation is a little bit more tenuous in terms of what I would consider to be the larger, like, what is the book, where is the book, who should have the book thing. It still sort of brings us out of our French reverie and says, hey, the world hasn't forgotten about you, the conflict hasn't forgotten about you, and the antagonist can still find you.
Yeah, you didn't run away. You thought you ran away, but you didn't. And I think it works for me because, as we discussed before, when we go to France, every time we go to France, things bog down in the main plot line. Things slow down. We kind of end up in this romantic bubble of France. And so what I think it does is, you're right, it brings things back into a clear perspective, and it moves us forward from where for the last couple of chapters we've kind of been just like hanging out.
It's the beginning of a relatively long kick in the teeth. And when I call it the beginning of the reversal, it's because I believe that we get to the real sort of midpoint reversal for everything in the next 3 chapters. And we get to a place
It's kind of a longer slope.
It is a slower burn, but I think that's because the story is doing 2 things at once. I think it's because it is doing the reversal midpoint crisis for the romance, simultaneously but not exactly contemporaneously with the crisis point for the larger story. I think that Domenico is more of like, is kind of a pinch point before we get to the actual reversal, and then to the sort of like no way out bottom of Act 2. It doesn't come until later.
So we have a bit of a garden chat. We do get a mention of feeding on humans here. Domenico, as it turns out, has different ethics than Matthew does when it comes to that. But it is one of our only times that we actually talk about eating humans. And we've talked about that several times on the pod, so I thought I would pull it out.
It's also the first time we really deal with a vampire who poses an actual threat, because so far the vampires that we've met in this book have been threatening but not an actual threat to Diana.
Yeah, and we've talked about vampires who could pose a threat, but we've never met them.
And now we have met Domenico, and he is threatening to say the very least.
We get quite a lot of talk about the Covenant, which is why he is there. Apparently Domenico and Louisa had a thing way back in the Wayback Machine. And we get some talk about the congregation. We don't really learn anything that we didn't know already. He's just kind of bringing it all back into focus for us. But one of the things we do get when Diana goes back inside, and they go up to the tower and they put up the de Clermont family emblem to warn the town that an unfamiliar vampire is in the area, we do get some internal narrative from Diana about her aunt's understanding of the Covenant and how that differs from what the actual Covenant is. We have her saying that, they never wanted me to become a lawyer because, now she sees it as like an imperfect understanding of, creatures not being involved in politics, which is part of the Covenant.
And I wonder to what extent, remember, we have this sort of fraught relationship between Em and Sarah and Diana vis-a-vis the use of magic, but also the world of creatures, and whether there's just part of it that Em and Sarah were like, well, she doesn't want to know, so we're not going to tell her.
Right. We're just going to keep her from being a lawyer. So whether or not they actually have an imperfect understanding of the Covenant, or if that's just what they have communicated to her, is not clear. But again, as we talked about just a little bit earlier, there is no formal school for creatures. So how else are they to learn about all of the creature laws except from each other? And if it's passed down, like we talked about, just like with magic, you can see how an imperfect understanding becomes the norm because it's been handed down. Because it's not written, you don't have the creature book of laws that you have on your shelf at home.
What do you think Isabeau thinks about the Covenant? Or what is the text telling us that Isabeau thinks?
My impression of her in this chapter, she obviously sees the danger in it. And I think that's one of the problems that she has and why she's so icy with Diana. On the other hand, I think that she's not a strong proponent of it. I think she thinks it's BS. But that's just my impression. How about you?
I feel similarly. I think that Isabeau is not the Covenant's biggest fan, but one of Isabeau's strengths is the ability to see how things will affect her and her family and the things that she cares about. And so she's more interested in defending and protecting the Covenant for the sake of her son and what it will mean to be involved with Diana than she is in the Covenant for the Covenant's sake.
Because she's lived long enough to have the foresight where she's like, these are all the things that could happen if this goes badly.
And I think there's a longer conversation that we could have about Isabeau and power and what kind of power is important to Isabeau. She is not, unlike some of the other creatures that we have met or will meet, she is less interested in being involved in the world of humans in the first place. She does not really have the yen for earthly power or for influence, and that makes her very different from some other creatures who see their long life, exceptional wealth, etc. as an opportunity to meddle and get involved, and that's just not who she is.
But that's also part of her just not being a fan of the congregation in general. Even if they didn't meddle in the world of humans, she's just not interested in being involved in the congregation, either because she disagrees with the creatures who happen to be members or because of, previous experience, whatever that may be.
What level of responsibility do we think that Isabeau has or should have for doing Matthew's dirty work in terms of telling Diana what's what?
I think she does the right thing in telling Diana, because I think it's something that Diana needs to know. I also think it's something that Matthew should have told her. And, you know, we have this vampire showing up talking about all of these things that Diana has no idea about. And Isabeau sees that and she's like, okay, we got to remedy this right away.
But we also see how reckless Diana is, because Diana basically squares up to Domenico and she's like, I'm having an excellent French country date with my boyfriend. Why are you here? I didn't sign no covenant.
But she's like completely ignorant of, you know, everything. And so on the one hand, she's like, okay, honey, you're embarrassing yourself and we need to fix that. But also you're putting yourself in danger. And you're putting Matthew in danger, and you're putting this whole family in danger because of the things that Matthew should have told you but hasn't.
Or, I mean, I'm not going to absolve necessarily Sarah and M from it.
Oh, Sarah and M. No.
Or any
not
of
at
the
all.
other
Like,
witches
least...
in Madison, etc. Because, like, Diana has been around some other witches. Maybe not many, but it's certainly textual in the first 2 chapters that there were other witches around after her parents' death, and somebody could have been like, baby Diana, there are some things you need to know about the world.
Here is Creature World 101, your primer, your cliff notes, if you will.
And, like, the breathless recklessness with which Diana throws herself at unfamiliar horses, rides the same horses without stirrups and reins with her eyes closed, and then throws herself in front of an unfamiliar vampire it's remarkable. I mean, she really does have this streak of abandon that has been, in my opinion, rather closely managed and monitored for too long.
Right. Which I feel I really enjoy Diana when she's being more active in this book most of the time, because there are so many things that she doesn't understand and doesn't have experience with. Most of the time she's being recklessly active and doesn't even know it. And she will maintain that active nature, but as she like grows into her powers, she'll become less reckless. Which is great.
And I feel like this is maybe a turning point for her character that we can track for the rest of the book in terms of her beginning to be really truly active in herself and of herself in a way that we haven't seen since she met Matthew. He's been driving the train, at least for the past 6 chapters, in a way that deprives her a little bit of her agency and keeps her from being the protagonist she is capable of being when she wants to. And I think that she begins to come more into herself here.
Yeah, I concur. Do we have anything else we want to say about these 3 chapters?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty thorough.
Yeah.
So in our next reading, we will be discussing chapters 22, 23, and 24. That will likely be coming out on or about New Year's. We haven't really sorted out the rest of our holiday schedule, but one way or the other, we hope that wherever you are and whatever you're doing this festive season, that you're safe, you are warm, you are happy, and that you are surrounded by the things and the people that you love.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And if you would like to continue a discussion with us, which we always love hearing from you, our listeners, you can do so through email. We are at chamomileandclovecast@gmail.com, or you can find us on Twitter at chamomileinclove, or by using the hashtag #CCAlchemy to discuss with us your thoughts on all of our readings so far.
We look forward to hearing from you, and we look forward to talking to you about chapters 22 through 24. So thank you for listening, and good night.
Thank you. Bye.